Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Robin Wiegman, and I have the great honor to introduce and moderate a keynote session at the Feminist Theory Workshop this afternoon. I'm especially grateful to Jennifer Nash's invitation to participate this year, to welcome Professor Linda Zerilli, and to introduce all of you to the critical scope and far-reaching influence of her work. Here's kind of some of the standard information, I guess is how I would put it, okay? All right, there's a genre for everything. Professor Zerilli is the Charles E. Merriam Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science and the College at the University of Chicago, where she is also Professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies and former Director of the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality there. She has received numerous fellowships for her research, including awards from Fulbright, the Institute for Advanced Study, and the Stanford Humanities Center, and has delivered keynotes at conferences and symposia throughout the world. Her scholarship has appeared in a range of interdisciplinary journals, from Signs, Social Texts, and Diacritics, to Women in Politics, New Literary History, Political Theory, and Theory and Event. I'm naming ones we might know, right? And there's the European Journal of Political Thought and many others. And her work has been translated into 10 languages, including Chinese, Korean, Turkish, Russian, and Arabic. At her home institution, she is well known as a talented and committed teacher, receiving the 2016 University Faculty Award for Excellence in Graduate Teaching and Mentoring. Among her graduate offerings, one finds Feminism and the Radical Democratic Imaginary, or The Idea of Critical Political Theory, or Knowledge in Politics, or New Directions in Feminist Political Theory, or French Feminist Theory, or Feminism in the Linguistic Turn, and a recent course, Advanced Theories of Gender and Sexuality. This last course, the advanced one, I confessed I lust over it. And you can get the syllabuses on the academia.edu under Linda Zerilli, okay? I'm sure that when the Trump people find out about academia.edu, it may disappear. So I encourage you to get all the shit off of it now, okay? Not just Zerilli, but all of us. I mean, really. You know, my paranoia, let's just say you can never be paranoid enough right now, and it's absolutely true. So I think Sedgwick would change her mind on that one. So I lust over this course, given the way it fulfills the ever-present imperative in feminist studies to account for and explore histories and theories of social, psychic, and structural systems of difference in ways that not only offer the most complicated understanding of our often fetishized critical method, intersectionality, but unearth the critical contexts in which key feminist texts emerged, contexts irreducible to the terms of feminist debate alone. The syllabus moves from studying systems of oppression to the hard work of analyzing structures, whether linguistic or discursive or heteropatriarchal and racial capitalist. From there to, Chicago's on a quarter system, so things move really fast. And one of the things that I love about the syllabus is each week she gives a really thick description of what the text engagements will be. So following that, there's a meeting on the complexities of the sex-gender system, on sexuality and biopolitics, on modes of capitalist accumulation, exploitation, and expropriation. All of this before addressing the urgent critiques of humanism's longue durée in racializing sexuality and gender. Along the way, the course weaves multiple genealogies of feminist thought through histories of Marxist, Foucauldian, new materialist, Afro-pessimist, post-colonial, and queer theories, offering an incredibly illuminating understanding of feminist entanglements with critical theory writ large in its 50-year sojourn since post-structuralism challenged long-standing accounts of the relationship between the subject, or more aptly, her subjectivation, and the forms and forces of the cultural and the social. So among the figures that you would encounter in this course, and I'm not sure, when I say I lust over it, I'm not sure that if I want to take it or I wish that I had invented it. So it's it's both. I want to take it in order so that I can feel like I invented it if I taught it. So it's Gail Rubin, Hortense Spillers, Gayatri Spivak, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, Wendy Brown, Jennifer Morgan, Sylvia Winter, and many others. I emphasize Professor Zerilli's teaching and the architecture of this course because when I first read the syllabus, it crystallized so much of what draws me to her scholarship. Its rigor, its clarity of purpose, its deep investment in the historical genealogies from which knowledge is constructed and contested, and quite simply, its hunger. Its hunger for the work that feminist theory can enable and perform. It is this that marks for me each of her monographs, totaling now 4, with the 4th titled A Democratic Theory of Truth, published just 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, right? Its title places it in companionship with her 2016 book, A Democratic Theory of Judgment, which was preceded by Feminism and the Abyss of Freedom in 2005, and Signifying Woman in 1994. These titles go a long way to signal the critical concerns that have defined Professor Zerilli's distinguished scholarly career: feminism, freedom, woman, theory, judgment, and with double emphasis, democracy. In the interest of time, I will resist describing each of these works, insisting instead that if you haven't already, you must read them, because each engages from different angles the ongoing possibility of a world we might want, and the risk of getting caught in ways of thinking that are far more bound to what we contest than we are often willing to let ourselves know. All of this is to say that Professor Zerilli writes, teaches, and thinks as a feminist political theorist. A 3-word description that risks underestimating in its simplicity the challenges she has faced, not only as a feminist theorist in a field, political science, that has not been, let's say, especially warm to feminist thought, but also as a theorist, given long-standing contestations in political science between the subfield of political theory and work often taken as more central to the discipline's approach to politics, things like rational choice or cognitive behavioralism, etc. Of course, there are some departments, fortunately, that subvert or even invert these antagonisms, but my point here is to signal the value, especially at this moment of worldwide far-right revolution. We need to rethink our aspiration of that term as only being in our interests. So signal the value for the Feminist Theory Workshop of being able to be in conversation with a scholar who has been committed to disciplinary and interdisciplinary interventions in the name of both feminism and theory, and who offers us ways of thinking about politics, knowledge, ordinary life, and feminist democratic futures that takes the work we are all committed to into compelling and challenging directions. Let me say as well that Professor Zerilli, Linda, is a long-standing friend of the program at Duke, and it is for that reason, as well as what I've said previously here, that I really want to ask you to give her a robust welcome back.
Okay, well, this is always a moment where you feel like you have to live up to what someone just said about you, and I'm not sure I'm capable of that. I want to thank Robin for that incredibly generous and really thoughtful introduction. I also want to say how honored I am to speak at this conference. I mean, we live in dark times, and the fact of this conference really does give me hope. So thank you so much. So specific thanks to the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies and its faculty chair, Jennifer Nash. Thank you, Jennifer, for inviting me. And also I want to thank Julie and Jeremy and Kyla and Amanda and everyone else that was signaled before by Jennifer for all the work they've done in putting this together. What role do feminist accounts of the past play in opening the present and the future to radical democratic transformation? This question of critical feminist historiography can be productively approached through Cornelius Castoriadis's twin ideas of history as creation and world-building imagination. In the Imaginary Institution of Society, originally published in French in 1975, he argues, quote, "The question of history is the question of the emergence of radical otherness or the absolutely new," unquote. Insofar as traditional historiography treats society as given, as always already instituted, it fails to account for its subject matter. History is an ongoing process of instituting, that is, the collective praxis of radical imagination and its creation of new socio-political forms. Indeed, it is, quote, "impossible to understand what human history has been or what it is now outside the category of the imaginary," he declares. In this talk, I'll unpack this claim and argue for its relevance to a freedom-centered feminist historiography. Many feminist historians have been trained in an academic discipline that has traditionally shunned creative imagination as antithetical to its enterprise. In the received view, historical inquiry discovers and presents objective facts. The two meanings of history, what happened and what was said to have happened, should be as closely aligned as current historical knowledge allows. On the one hand, mimetic or reproductive imagination is tolerated insofar as the objects of history are by definition absent from experience. As the British philosopher R.G. Collingwood argued, we must exercise imagination when working with historical documents. Quote, "Using the mimetic imagination in history means visualizing something that we presume was at one time ontologically actual, even if it is no longer present to our senses. We experience this now absent past indirectly, by experiencing the remnants of the past and filling in that which is absent," unquote. On the other hand, imagination must be confined, according to Collingwood and most historians who come after him, to this mimetic or reproductive function, filling in the gaps of our perception, but not generating anything new. Narrative form is, of course, unavoidable. A story, after all, is told, but it should not be based on a chronological ordering of facts filled in where appropriate. It should be based, on a chronological ordering of facts filled in where appropriate, not a creative retelling or rearranging of them. As Peter Novick writes, quote, "The professional historians of the late 19th century, in pursuit of the authority of science, consistently distanced themselves from and disparaged history as literature, history as art. This view persisted into the mid-20th century and influenced debates about historical objectivity. Historiography is one thing, creativity another. Productive imagination belongs to the latter, not to the former. Genuine historical knowledge depends on maintaining the difference." At least since Foucault's 1969 Archaeology of Knowledge, this realist understanding of history has been challenged by throwing the foundation of historical knowledge, the archive, into question. As, quote, "the law of what can be said, the institution of the archive does not collect and store statement events, writes informations. It anticipated later critiques by Gayatri Spivak, Jacques Derrida, and Michel Triot, each identifying hidden forms of archival authority. In their view, academic historical knowledge is created through absences, the active repressing or forgetting of events and actors that do not fit within the temporal framework of the received understanding of historical narrative. These absences normalize historically contingent power relations, lending them the guise of necessity, as if history could not have been otherwise. Critiques of the archive as a form of power were crucial to developing women's history in the second half of the 20th century. Early works questioned what counts as history by expanding the archive to include, for example, the domestic sphere and bringing in women as agents of social order and social change. They demonstrated that women's absence as historical actors had been no mere oversight, but an epistemological condition of what historians considered their proper subject matter, namely great men, world historical events, formal political institutions, etc. Even with their essential contributions to rethinking what counts as history and a historical actor, most of these early works did not rigorously question historical realism. Feminist historians such as Joan Wallach Scott, working with the critique of representation developed in Foucault and Derrida, examined women's history for its uncritical reliance on the category of experience as a self-evident meaning and category of women. Beginning in the late 1980s and 1990s, post-structuralist feminist historians sought to analyze the narrative forms and methodological implications of writing about feminist pasts. Challenging conventional historical practice, they aim not simply to expand the archive by including women, but to question the nature of historical evidence and historical experience, foregrounding questions of representation, language, and narrative in historical writing. Some of the most pointed challenges to historical realism in the institution of the archive came from feminist historians of slavery, who faced the archive as a hard limit on critical research. Among various strategies for navigating the normative system of enunciability, Saidiya Hartman's writing stands out for its radical refusal to accept received archival demands. In her renowned 2008 essay, Venus in Two Acts, she argues that the institution of the archive makes it impossible to tell the story of enslaved people, like a girl called Venus, killed with impunity by the captain of the slave ship Recovery. To the extent, I quote, to the extent that her life and the lives of the hundreds of thousands who share her circumstances can have any reality for us today, it is only through brief mention of cargo and property in the ledgers and memoirs of the slave traders and enslavers. Further, she writes, the archive of slavery rests upon a founding violence. This violence determines, regulates, and organizes the kinds of statements that can be made about slavery, as well as it creates subjects and objects of power, unquote. To write history following its protocols would be either to condone what has been said of the enslaved or to leave their stories untold for lack of historical evidence. Quote, I chose not to tell a story of Venus because to do so would have trespassed the boundaries of the archive. History pledges to be faithful to the limits of fact, evidence, and archive, even as those dead certainties are produced by terror, unquote. Critical of her own complicity in what Foucault called the law of what can be said, Hartman asks, is it possible to exceed or negotiate the constitutive limits of the archive? And she responds, by advancing a series of speculative arguments and exploiting the capacities of the subjunctive, a grammatical mood that expresses doubts, wishes, and possibilities in fashioning a narrative which is based on archival research, and by that, I mean a critical reading of the archive that mimes the figurative dimensions of history, I intended to tell an impossible story and to amplify the impossibility of its telling. Hartman went on to adopt the conditional temporality of the past subjunctive. She explores what could have been to symbolize the space of a different kind of thinking, a space of productive attention, as she writes, to the scene of loss, a thinking of twofold attention that seeks to encompass at once the positive objects and methods of history and social science, and the matters absent, entangled, and unavailable by its methods, unquote. Describing her alternative method as critical fabulation, Hartman boldly embraces the place of creative imagination in historiography. Her historical practice refuses the idea that the archive should give the law of what can be said. Quote, "The intent of this practice is not to give voice to the slave, but rather to imagine what cannot be verified using received methods." Critical fabulation, she writes, requires narrative restraint, the refusal to fill in the gaps and provide closure, a task that is assigned to mimetic imagination in conventional historical accounts. In Hartman's view, historical realism demands a search for more historical evidence to shore up the archive as the repository of the real and the necessary, contributing to its silence and violence. Consequently, it is less a matter of adding new facts than of exposing the archive's cracks, fissures, and gaps to recover contingency and fabulate what could have been by rearranging the basic elements of the story, telling it anew from contested standpoints. Risking fidelity to historical truth, critical fabulation deploys imagination to forge critical historiography. Describing her project with Foucault as a history of the present, Hartman understands the critical horizon of counterhistories of slavery to be directed at the ongoing and incomplete project of freedom and the precarious life of the ex-slave. As she understands it, a history of the present strives to illuminate the intimacy of our experience with the lives of the dead, to write our now as it is interrupted by this past, and to imagine a free state, not as the time before captivity or slavery, but rather as the anticipated future of this writing, unquote. Critical fabulation is Hartman's methodological wager that such a space of freedom emerges in the realm of the visible on the condition of risking received realist ideas of historical truth. Such truth must be risked, for it endows the past with an aura of obviousness and presents contingency in the guise of necessity. Nevertheless, Hartman is clear about the limits of her imaginative counterhistory at the intersection of the fictive and the historical. It cannot repair the broken past or restore Venus's humanity. On the contrary, telling Venus's story is to meet the limits of writing history through the act of narration. Hartman's anticipatory temporality of freedom and insistence on the essential role and limits of creative imagination in historical writing speaks to the impossibility of redress in the face of the unspeakable. The necessity, I quote, of trying to represent what we cannot, rather than leading to pessimism or despair, must be embraced as the impossibility that conditions our knowledge of the past and animates our desire for a liberated freedom, unquote. This claim on the present presses us to recognize continuity with the past in ways that the historically progressive story of abolition and civil rights can include. Hartman's work is a trailblazing and mostly singular example of what it might mean to embrace creative imagination as essential to critical feminist historiography, a practice that must be concerned with freedom and how it would be possible to think and act otherwise, in a word, autonomously. In what follows, I'll argue that Cornelius Castoriadis's work on creative imagination, history as creation, and democratic autonomy can further help feminists move beyond the impasses of current debates and embrace imagination for a form of critical feminist historiography that animates action and judgment in the present. The virtual taboo on creative imagination in traditional historiography, argues Castoriadis, reflects an understanding of history as the causal unfolding events, according to a logic uncovered and documented by the historian. Most historians have remained hostage to either functionalism or structuralism, which attempts to explain history in a, quote, rational manner and views social institutions from the functional economic point of view. Reducing the symbolic language to an expression of the, quote, real needs of a society, functionalists cannot account for the fact that the choice of a symbol is never either inevitable or merely haphazard. A symbol never imposes itself with a natural necessity, but neither does it lack all reference to reality. Instead, he explains, the symbolic takes into account the real rational and includes an imaginary element that, quote, presupposes the capacity to see in a thing what it is not, to see in it something other than it is. The radical imaginary has its source in the subject's faculty of positing things and relations that have never been given in perception. The imaginary is the root of the symbolic, and there is no way to grasp the real shorn of the imaginary. Failure to recognize this imaginary element, received accounts of social institutions cannot account for human history as creation. This failure amounts to heteronomy, the denial that societies are the source and ground of their own institutions. In Castoriadis's view, Marxism exemplifies the functional economic approach, and in the end is simply another philosophy of history, unable to recognize history of the emergence of the new. Insisting that historical phenomena cannot be accounted for in strictly causal terms, he calls attention to the most significant non-causal element in history, human creativity. On the one hand, there are, quote, deviations presented by the real behavior of individuals in relation to their typical behavior, which introduces an element of unpredictability. On the other hand, the non-causal appears at another level, and this is what is really important, he writes. It appears not as behavior that is merely unpredictable, but creative. It appears not as a simple deviation in relation to an existing type of behavior, but as the positing of a new type of behavior, as the institution of a new social rule, as the invention of a new object or a new form, which cannot be deduced from what already exists. As historical beings, humans can provide new responses to the same situations or create new situations. History as creation is essential to what Castoriadis calls the project of autonomy, recognizing that we are the source of our social institutions and forms, that they are contingent, and that they can be otherwise. This recognition entails a precise understanding of what creation involves. We must think of the new anew. Castoriadis explains, the new is not the unforeseeable, unpredictable, nor the undetermined. Something can be unpredictable, for example, the next number in a roulette, and still be the trivial repetition of a form, or be undetermined, and again a sheer repetition of a given form, for example, quantum phenomena. Something is new when it is in the position of a form neither producible nor deducible from other forms, unquote. The subject matter of history is time as creation, the production of new forms. Critical historiography concerns the singular appearance, that which has no causal determinant and cannot be deduced from what was there before. In other words, history should concern the particular. A freedom-centered feminist historiography would take such novelty as its actual subject matter. It would approach history as the open-ended creation of new socio-political forms and significations through radical imaginary instituting activity. It would share Hartman's anticipatory temporality of freedom and, where appropriate, employ critical fabulation to retrieve pasts that can make claims upon the present while recognizing the impossibility of some of the stories it tells. Rather than shore up the unilinear and progressive conception of time and history under the waves of feminism, such historiography uses creative imagination to call forth divergent standpoints and contested stories, challenging historical necessity and the archive as the law of what can be said. Feminist historiography animates critical thinking, political action, and reflective judgment in the present. Castoriadis defines creativity as the world-making capacity of the radical imagination to originate forms, significations, and institutions that cannot be derived from or explained by antecedent conditions alone. Man's distinguishing trait, he writes, is not logic but imagination, and more precisely, unbridled imagination, defunctionalized imagination. As radical imagination of the singular psyche and as social instituting imaginary, this imagination provides the conditions for reflective thought to be able to exist, therefore also for a science and even a psychoanalysis to exist, unquote. Like traditional historiography, Western philosophical and political thought is characterized by a resistance to creative imagination, replacing it with reproductive or mimetic imagination, or what Castoriadis calls the second imagination. He insists that reflective thought could not get off the ground without this productive, creative imagination, the form-giving power of transcendental imagination that Kant discovered in the A edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, only, as Heidegger put it, to recoil in the B edition, for it stood as the bottomless abyss that threatened the basis of objective knowledge. Whereas the second imagination is confined to working with existing concepts, the first imagination creates them. Castoriadis rejects the Western philosophical tradition's reduction of creative imagination to fiction, but recognizes that when we speak of the imaginary, we often want to talk about something that is invented. It is assumed that the imaginary is separate from the real, whether it claims to take the latter's place in the form of a lie, or makes no such claim in the form of a novel. In his view, however, the real cannot be grasped without the imaginary any more than sensible intuitions can be grasped without imagination in Kant. But neither can the imaginary be reduced to the real. Even an imaginative historiographic practice such as Hartman's critical fabulation does not deny all relation to the archive and empirical artifacts. She admits that her own writing is, quote, unable to exceed the limits of the sayable dictated by the archive. It depends upon legal records, surgeons' journals, ledgers, ship manifests, and captain's logs. And in this regard, it falters before the archive's silence and reproduces its omissions. The irreparable violence of the Atlantic slave trade resides in all the stories that we cannot know and that will never be recovered. This formidable obstacle, writes Hartman, or constitutive impossibility, defines the parameters of my work. The archive limits critical fabulation, which aims to transform our relationship to the past and with it the present. Hartman consciously, quote, performs the limits of writing history to make visible the incomplete project of freedom and the precarious life of the ex-slave, those living after the afterlife of slavery today. Quote, those existences deemed non-historical or deemed waste exercise a claim on the present and demand us to imagine a future in which the afterlife of slavery has ended, unquote. Put otherwise, critical fabulation cannot repair the past, but it can facilitate a critical relationship to the past that promotes autonomy and freedom in the present, generating what Castoriadis calls the newly thinkable. Trying to make sense of how critical reflection on instituted social imaginary significations becomes possible, Castoriadis insists that critical imagination plays a crucial role. Quote, reflection appears when thought turns back upon itself and interrogates itself not only about its particular contents, but also about its presuppositions and its foundations. Genuine reflection is the challenging of the given institution of society, putting into question socially instituted representations, unquote. Reflection is crucial to autonomy. Quote, it implies the work of the subject's radical imagination by which one can provisionally suspend the ultimate axioms, criteria, and rules that belong to any social order. Though these cannot be suspended all at once, as a skeptic would charge, each in their turn can be provisionally suspended. Democratic societies characterized by autonomy are capable of steady critical reflection on socially instituted practices and premises. What makes such suspension possible is not radical doubt, as modern skepticism would have it. Instead, reflection is the work of radical imagination, the creation of figures or models of the thinkable. Castoriadis explains, all theoretical work, all work of reflection, the entire history of science, shows that creative imagination is at work positing figures or models which are not fixed once and for all, which in no way could be considered as empirically inferred, but which are, on the contrary, conditions for the organization of empirical knowledge, or more generally, the object of thought. Thus, the imagination gives rise creatively to the newly thinkable. For example, Freud's imaginary construction of fantasy made the psychic realm thinkable, albeit not refutable or falsifiable in Karl Popper's sense. There is a crucial difference between Freud's plausible model of the psychic apparatus and saying, all that happens because red currant jelly travels along neural pathways. Such a claim cannot withstand examination within the institution of modern science. Figures of the newly thinkable do not arise out of thin air, but are related to the empirical field of knowledge in which they occur. Castoriadis elaborates, more generally, we can say that any important new theory, that of Newton, Einstein, Darwin, or Freud himself, not to mention those of philosophers, is never simply an induction any more than it is a mere product by subtraction or the falsification of previously existing theories. It is, under the constraint of the data, the positing of a new imaginary figure or model of intelligibility. Insisting that a new theory comes into being by positing a new figure or model of intelligibility under the constraint of the data, Castoriadis anticipates the critic's objection that, say, Freud's fantasizing is nothing but the activity of imagination out of control. The social imaginary is not limitless, but constrained by what exists. The given found expression in the limits of the archive and the unsay or the sayable that determine the parameters of Hartmann's work. Creation, in other words, is conditioned, but not determined. It begins with material already given in social life. Yet such figures are not simply discovered as if they were always awaiting our notice. They are created contingently. They could have been otherwise. Thus, like any form or ethos, new imaginary figures of the thinkable are new because they cannot be derived from the data any more than they are unconditioned by the data. Like any meaning or signification created by humans, I'm not really sure what's going on here with these slides, but okay. I didn't push that button, by the way, that they told me not to push. It's just, this always happens to me. That's why I never used PowerPoint or anything. Returning to critical feminist historiography, we can now define it as a form of critical reflection that posits new figures of the thinkable in an effort to break closure, which otherwise defines what it means to be a subject and to live in society. Closure refers to the social significations that remain primarily unquestioned in historical realism. Creative imagination and reflection open what Castoriadis calls a new object of psychical investment, a non-object, an invisible object, the truth. I speak of truth here not as the adequation of thought to a thing, but as the moment that tends to open breaches in our closure, wherever thought tends to shut itself up again. What would it mean for feminist historiography to approach the question of historical truth in this way, rather than the adequation of a concept to a thing, as historical realism would have it? Feminist historiography, especially early women's history, has been concerned with historical truth, understood as the adequation of historical writing to events. that is, closing the gap between the two meanings of history I discussed earlier, what happened and what was said to have happened. This concern follows from tasking feminist women's history with making the actions and actors missing from received androcentric historical writing visible. We saw, however, that this idea of historiography risks remaining hostage to the demands of historical realism, the past as a stable unitary object to be recovered, rather than the field of contingent particulars that need to be accounted for, given meaning, and judged from different points of view. Critical feminist historiography approaches the past as a contested site of meaning, shot through a contingency, paths not taken, and causes defeated, which need to be narrated and brought into a more extensive practice of political understanding and judgment. Let's see. As Hartman tells us, okay, that's not the same quote. Well, all right. Okay, forget this. As Hartman told us, you just have to take my word for it. As Hartman told us, by quote, by playing with and rearranging the basic, and this is literally the last time I used PowerPoint, by playing with and rearranging the basic elements of the story, by representing the sequence of events in divergent stories, and you know what, ich mach das aus. Okay. Yeah, I got to compete with that. Okay, by playing with and rearranging the basic elements of the story, by representing the sequence of events in divergent stories and from contested points of view, I have attempted to jeopardize the status of the event, to displace the received or authorized event, and to imagine what might have happened, or might have been said, or might have been done, unquote. I took Hartman not to invent an event ex nihilo, but rather to reimagine what took place by seeing it from perspectives presupposed but not represented in the archive. What does a slave ship look like from the position of someone like Venus, who has been brutally captured, sexually abused, and confined to its damp, cramped space? What does a slave auction look like from the perspective of those sold there? The archive cannot answer these questions, as it contains only enslaver records and words. What is more, to answer using the archive's evidence is to repeat its violence. Filling out the archive with the voices of the enslaved, even if possible, would be to affirm its demand for evidence based on a positivist conception of truth, the adequation of a concept to a thing. That, in turn, would make the lives that find no representation there nothing, as if their existence and suffering did not make, quote, a claim on the present and demand us to imagine a future in which the afterlife of slavery has ended, unquote. Nevertheless, it is under the constraint of the data, as Castoriadis put it, that Hartman's critical fabulation can inaugurate a different relation to the past, present, and future. There were such ships and auctions, that much we know. But critically fabulating the impossible stories of enslaved figures like Venus disrupts our knowledge, not only of the Middle Passage, whose, quote, irreparable violence resides precisely in all the stories that we cannot know and that will never be recovered, unquote, but also of its afterlife in our present. Quote, if this story of Venus has any value at all, it is in illuminating the way in which our age is tethered to hers, unquote. Refusing the archival demand of realism, do Castoriadis and Hartman yield historical truth to historical relativism? If our particular imaginary significations always circumscribe our knowledge, then it would seem as if truth can be nothing but relative. This is what Castoriadis, however, calls the idea of truth as correctness. That is the socially instituted truth, which has its own rules and processes of validation. But this truth, he writes, is not reflective in the sense of autonomy that I described earlier. It does not allow us to question the established institution of society or compare and judge different societies. It does not create new figures of the thinkable that question the ultimate axioms, criteria, and rules of a given order. Quote, "The discourse on history is included within history," writes Castoriadis. "To have an experience of history as a historical being is to be in and of history." The charge of relativism misses the mark. It assumes that to appraise history critically, we, feminists, must stand outside history. Castoriadis rejects the idea of an external standpoint from which it would be possible to grasp historical truth. The search for this standpoint assumes that rootedness is by definition a limited condition of historical understanding. On the contrary, he writes, rootedness is also a positive condition, for it is our own particularity that allows us access to the universal. It is because we are attached to a given view, categorical structure, and project that we are able to say something meaningful about the past. It is only when the present is intensely present that it makes us see in the past something different and something more than the past saw in itself. When writing history, the temptation to rationalism and historical realism persists as long as we repudiate rootedness as the condition of historical knowledge. However, rootedness should not be equated with what Castoriadis called closure, the instituted feature of the social historical in which we never put established truths into question. Instead, rootedness should be understood as a condition of all genuine critical reflection through radical imagination and the positing of new forms or figures of the thinkable. Nothing guarantees that such reflection will occur. Rootedness can result in closure. However, it is crucial to Castoriadis' idea of creation, history as creation, that rootedness also enables historical knowledge in ways that support new beginnings and autonomy in the present. To conclude, I began this talk by asking what role feminist accounts of the past might play in opening the present and the future to radical democratic imagination of transformation, gaining clarity about the hazards of historical writing and the possibilities of new temporalities, such as the subjective tense of critical fabulation, requires a better understanding of what feminist political actors, not only historians, want and need history for. From the perspective of democratic feminist politics, it has been hard to imagine a relation to past feminisms other than the pre-modern idea of the past as a storehouse of examples, which received his feminist historiography at once displaces and preserves. Though the supposedly transcended past is left behind, it persists in the form of a haunting past, at once calcified in the standard narrative, 1848 Seneca Falls, and rendered invisible as an object of critique. Feminism's entanglement with the histories and afterlives of slavery, colonialism, and imperialism calls for political judgment. Yet the capacity to judge is foreclosed by the temporal model of linear progress, according to which history is presumed to judge and the vanquished have no say. We cannot redeem the feminist past by taking what was good, calling it our heritage, and casting off the bad, which by itself time will bury in oblivion, to paraphrase Hannah Arendt. But neither can we escape this past by refusing it, calling it alien, and casting it off as an unwanted legacy. In both cases, we use exhausted criteria of judgment formed under its aegis. Instead, we must wrestle with the problem of judging the particular without a concept or rule, the form of judgment that Hannah Arendt, following Kant's third critique, called reflective, for which creative imagination is essential. Reflective judgment is less a choice than all that remains in the gap between past and future in which to think what we are doing after the collapse of inherited criteria under the weight of a catastrophic past. It is also the only form of judgment suited to feminist historiography, for which the past is not a self-evident category, ontologically singular and recoverable with the proper epistemological methods, but a site of contested meaning, repeated silencing, and ongoing political struggle. Seeking to broaden the task of critical historiography to animate action and judgment in the present, feminists should prioritize an approach to history focused on the creative inaugural capacities of imagination. In my larger project, I call this the world-making aspect of critical historiography, the feminist democratic imaginary, and show it to consist of provisional and contested new forms of the thinkable. Novel social and political forms that belong to what Hartman called the unfinished project of freedom. To say that rootedness is the condition of reflective critical thought and thus a freedom-centered feminist historiography is to recognize that firsthand experience is not the essential condition of judgment. Outsideness is. If we are to avoid presentism, we need to see the past through the eyes of those who lived and suffered it. But creative imagination goes further. It sees something different and something more than the past saw in itself, as Castoriadis put it. Seeing something different while eschewing the claim to objective knowledge of the past, Hartman does not try to speak for Venus or anyone else whose life was entangled with the violence and terror of the Atlantic slave trade. Instead, critical fabulation places the narrator, Hartman, outside the narrated scene, all the better to grasp the desire for freedom that surely was felt by those who suffered, but whose realization may have seemed out of reach from the material historical standpoint, the social institution of slavery in which they remain captive. This is not to say that the outside position of the living in the present remains untouched by past constraints. Critical fabulation brings the past into the present, making visible continuities between the enslaved and the ex-slave that are otherwise obscured by the linear and progressive temporality in which stories of abolition and civil rights are typically told. The same goes for our fraught relationship with the feminist past portrayed, for example, in the Waves narrative as a state of gender oppression steadily overcome. Hartman suggests, quote, at least two ways the historiographical operation can make a place for the living. One is attending to and recruiting the path for the sake of the living, establishing who we are in relation to who we have been, and the second entails interrogating the production of our knowledge of the past, unquote. Creative imagination gives critical feminist historiography access to both by generating new forms of the thinkable. Thank you so much.